So now we're going to take a look at the arthropods. Phylum Arthropoda is the phylum that contains probably the largest number of species of animals. There's, people estimate 75, even as much as 85% of all animal species, anywhere maybe from 5 to 10 million species belong to this group. The arthropods live in pretty much every environment and habitat. So we have terrestrial, marine, freshwater. They burrow down in the soil. They live up in trees in the canopy. They live pretty much in every environment on Earth except into the Arctic or the Antarctic, and probably not actually in the Antarctic Circle, but just outside it, you'll still find insects and some type of arthropod. Within the Arctic Circle, though, you'll find, well, not on the surface, insects. Beneath the water, you'll still find arthropods that are marine arthropods living in the oceans. And those very cold waters, you'll still see them there. So you pretty much see them all over the planet. They've adapted to all different environments by modifying their body in a variety of different ways. The relationships between arthropods and other animals is, again, constantly being changed a little bit. Even relationships within the group are being changed. So again, we're going to focus on a number of the key features that are parts of all the arthropods in general, and point out some of the major features of some of the different groups. As far as relationships go, it's something I'll get to a little bit more in a second lecture. I'm following the annelids with the arthropods in my class sequence. Traditionally, there's even a group sort of in between them. There was an annelid, onychophora, and arthropods. And the onychophora are kind of seen a little bit like a caterpillar-like animal, but they're sort of more worm-like, more annelid-like. And there's been a lot of links between specific characteristics and features that onychophora share with, say, polychaete worms and with arthropods, as if they're a link actually between the two groups. Recent classification puts arthropods and, say, nematodes closer together with ecdysoans, and I'll talk a little bit about that with the molting and as one characteristic that's now reorganized all these groups of animals, whereas the other traditional way had numerous characteristics shared between the groups and their development and a whole variety of different structures. So where it will eventually end up will probably continue to change. So not to worry about that as much. What do we have as characteristics? Well, they're bilateral in symmetry. They're triploblastic organisms, so that's kind of following along. They have an endoderm, ectoderm, mesoderm, and the mesoderm can now produce a lot of internal structures, which we'll kind of start to talk about as we look at the different body plans of some classic sort of arthropods. They are true coelomates, although their coelom is a little bit different. It is often referred to as a hemocoel. It's a hemo, kind of blood. It's because it's kind of open. So what happens is that the circulatory system, which is going to be really reduced typically in the insects and a little more well developed in the crustacea, is open to the coelom. So the coelom and the circulatory system kind of connect. They're not completely isolated or separate from one another. They do display the metamerism that we saw in the annelids, which, if you remember, that was called a repetition of structure among different segments of the animal's body. And so they have a segmented body, just like the annelids, but not exactly like them. So what we see in arthropods is something that's referred to as tagmatization. So generally we have groups called tagma. And so that term I just said was tagmatization, which kind of means sort of a fusion and a specialization of body regions, and segments. So instead of just having segment, we didn't see that exactly in the annelids anyway. If you recall, if we looked internally in the annelids, you had their digestive tract being very different in the anterior end of the animal, with a crop and a gizzard and the esophagus and the pharynx and all. And then as it got to the intestines, the rest of the body segments were very similar, pretty much the same as one another, but there was still specialization internally. So what we have here are the body broken into regions, and we have a couple varieties here. So we can have a head, a thorax, and then this region here, back posterior one, is referred to as the abdomen. So a number of arthropods display these three tagma, or these three major body regions. Some continue to have other fusion and specialization, and here the head and the thorax is sort of fused into one, so it's referred to as a cephalothorax. And then the tail sort of region, again, it is referred to as the abdomen. In the abdomen of the animals, generally, we see a lot more of that sort of metamerism, the repetition and segmentation. The other regions are then much more specialized, but like I said, even in the annelids, we saw something similar to that as well. So one of the major characteristics beyond that of the arthropods, and a unique characteristic here, is that they have an exoskeleton. Right? So the exoskeleton, also referred to as a cuticle, we're going to talk about the layers, as they're called, cuticle layers. This is kind of why they're put in this group called ecdysoans, because they have a non-living outer covering that protects them from the environment and also can protect them from pressure. It can do a whole variety of different things. In the arthropods, it's even far more advanced, because what we'll see is the muscular system within the arthropods being attached actually to this exoskeleton, and it can actually help them move. So they can fly and dig and do a whole variety of different things, and it can actually be very powerful with the ability to open and close parts of this exoskeleton as it forms different appendages within their bodies. And so they kind of as a combination of those. You don't see that in the other. So the nematodes don't have anything like that. They don't have any interaction between the muscular system and their cuticle. It's just the cuticle is an outer covering. It's made of completely different material than the arthropod cuticle. So it's just the idea that they have to molt it at some point in time is why some people have put them together or as being more close to one another. So what do we have as far as an exoskeleton goes? The exoskeleton is pretty thick. It's made up of material largely called chitin, which is a nitrogenous polysaccharide. So that means polysaccharide is a sugar. All right, so it's a sugar in chains, so it's many repeating sugar units. And then we have nitrogen groups attached to those sugars. Sugars typically don't. They're just carbon, oxygen, and hydrogen. But here we have nitrogen attached to them, so that they're a special type of nitrogenous polysaccharide. And they're called chitin, is the name of the molecule itself. So the living epidermis secretes the entire cuticle, or in this case, we call it the exoskeleton. There are multiple layers to this exoskeleton. There is the thickest layer here called the endocuticle. Then there is a thinner layer called the exocuticle. And finally, a top layer called the epicuticle. Now, the epicuticle is one that can also contain pigments. So when we see, a crab or a shrimp or some type of insect, and we see the color that you're seeing of that animal and its exoskeleton is then contained with the pigments and this epicuticle. Beneath that, then you have the endocuticle making up a lot of it. So it's most of these are all chitin plus protein. And then some of them, like the endocuticle, especially in the crustaceans, the ones that live in water, the aquatic ones, They then also have calcium salts. As part of that exoskeleton. So it makes them much harder and tougher. It also makes them heavier, and this is why we typically don't see that as much in the insects as a group, because they need to have a whole bunch of adaptations to stay light, right? Because insects in general are going to have appendages that develop into wings so that they can fly, so they can occupy really a whole other habitat. Their dispersal is very different. They can have a whole variety of different behaviors. They're important as pollinators, they're predators, there are all sorts of different ecological roles that they play, partly because that they're able to fly, but they do a whole variety of other things. They have different life cycles, some that live, like I said, burrow into the soil, some that help decomposition and deaden down trees, and a whole variety of different things that they do. But because of flight, they're going to have to often be very light. So their overall exoskeleton is often reduced in thickness. They typically don't have the calcium salts in it, or at least not very much, if they do have any at all, because they need to keep it thin and light weight. And they'll have other adaptations that we'll get to. So this is the basics of the exoskeleton. We have only such a limited amount of time and so many more groups of organisms to kind of cover in this class, so we can't go into everything. The process of, but I will mention a couple things because the terms come up and they'll keep coming up. So this process called ecdysis, which is again is why the arthropods have been put into a sort of a larger clade, a group called ecdysoans, and that's why some other groups of animals that have some type of cuticle, even made out of completely different material and everything else, but that have to molt it to kind of get rid of it and then regrow it, have been called ecdysoans. Is that just a type of convergent evolution and these other things are more important? Potentially, but again, that's sort of the more recent organization of the way things have been. The process of ecdysis in arthropods generally involves a place where the endocuticle becomes sort of detached here from the epidermis, but they keep it. So they keep the exoskeleton around them, and while they do that, they'll start to secrete. They'll start to secrete kind of a brand new exoskeleton will start to become produced while they still have the old one. And what the animal typically will do is it will also store a lot of water in it, and at some point in time the tissues of the animal will swell up. So it's not actually expanding its size with growth in terms of cell number. It's actually kind of expanding the cells, and that kind of pushes this other layer away. And then they kind of shrink back in, and then they go into a slightly dormant state where then they undergo a lot of cell division to actually grow their tissues and truly become larger in terms of actual tissue growth. So, and then they shed that whole exoskeleton. It's just left behind, the entire covering of the entire animal. That includes, all of its body regions. That includes all their appendages. That includes, wings. Everything is kind of shed, and then they're regrowing essentially this new system underneath it. Right? And it's very soft. It doesn't really harden up until after the molt takes place, and then eventually that's when calcium salts and other chemicals come in and then harden and toughen up those layers, and then it becomes a hard protective exoskeleton. Again, it's a super simplistic summary. There's way more to it than just that, but that just gives you a little bit of an idea of what goes on or how they essentially do it. So every time they grow, they have to get rid of their exoskeleton because the exoskeleton does not grow with them, right? So it's dead, it's non-living, it's like a shell, but we'll use the term shell when we talk about mollusks. And actually, the molluscan shell does grow with the animal. So as the animal gets bigger, it just actually makes a bigger shell and a bigger shell and a bigger shell, and it keeps inhabiting then larger parts of it. whereas the arthropods don't do that. They have to continually molt throughout their entire life. At least as long as they're growing, they have to continually molt that exoskeleton. And there's all sorts of things that people study with the chemicals that control molting and give signals to control it, and a whole variety of other sorts of interesting things, which again, we unfortunately don't have time to go into. Next, we'll kind of continue along here. Another characteristic of arthropods is that they have, with their exoskeleton, they have appendages. And so the appendages are covered by the exoskeleton, but now if they have this hard exoskeleton, then they won't be able to actually move these appendages. They'll just be sticking off them. So they need to have joints. So that the appendages have segments or sections. And now typically they have paired appendages on each side of their body. So if you took the animal, and divided it in half, like this, whatever appendage they have on one side, they would have on the other side. All right, like that. So the paired appendages, the appendages are jointed. And now one of the ways that different arthropods are often, sorry, gotta disappear for a second, pick that up. One of the ways that different arthropods are classified is often by the numbers of appendages that they have. So number of appendage and number of appendages per body region is an often used characteristic. So for example, many arthropods will have antennae. So let's see structures here. All right, so antennae are sensory structures, so they allow them to detect various things from their environment, from vibrations in the environment to chemicals in the air, so to essentially be able to smell, say for terrestrial arthropods like insects, and in the water for chemoreception, so it's like smelling, but again underwater, where their antennae can sense chemicals within the water. They antennae can do a variety of other things. Again, they have touch receptors and sensory vibration receptors and a variety of different types of receptors that they can get information from. They then have a brain, right? In this particular case, their brain is a cerebral ganglia. And the reason it's not a brain, right, is going to be because along the animal's body, what you're going to see is so in green here, I kind of put it in both of them. You have the best place to write it here, a ventral nerve cord. So the ventral nerve cord, again, it's going to be fairly common for most of our invertebrate animals, is that their nerve cord runs ventrally along the belly side. When we flip into the chordates, which are the animals that have a well, they don't all have a backbone, but the ancestral vertebrates, or just another type of chordate, and then their nerve cord is shifted dorsally, kind of to the back side, and then eventually the vertebrates then keep that, and it's a hollow dorsal one, and so on. Well, the nerve cord, as it runs ventrally, has a whole number of, and you can see I kind of drew these little sections here. There are additional ganglia. So the ganglia are concentrations of nerve cells and nerve tissue that act as kind of little small mini brains, sort of. That's just kind of the idea. That they're additional processing centers along segments of the animal's body, along regions that can help just speed up and control kind of localized activity. And so they do have a larger cerebral ganglia, which is often where all the sensations from the atmosphere and the things that the environment that they're in, they pick it up and then can process that and then behave and control and send signals throughout the rest of their body. But in addition to that, there's these other ganglia that are other little control centers all along the animal's body as well. A true brain doesn't have that. A true brain really has all these different ganglia from different regions. They're all just kind of fused into one then major brain structure. So they have numerous processing centers is the idea. Now, within the joints and related to the exoskeleton, we see something that is also kind of interesting and unique. I mentioned this earlier, that there is a connection between the exoskeleton and the muscular system. So let's say this is a particular appendage. One of these appendages here, and we're kind of looking at it like internally. So from the outside, it looks like they're maybe separate, but internally they're connected. And what we'll actually have is that internally then, there are muscle fibers attached to this segment here, and there are muscle fibers attached to this segment here, and then those muscle fibers through the joint are connected to one another like this. On the opposite side of the appendage, of the joint, same thing. And so what that means is that if these muscles contract and get shorter, what they're going to do is then kind of force this appendage to bend. See if I can draw this here, in this direction. Whoops, sorry, I did the opposite way here. So let's just say these are the ones that are contracting here, so they're getting shorter. So these are going to be longer and stretched out, and then that bends the animal, or that bends the appendage itself on that joint, so that one part of it extends and the other part of it gets tighter. So just kind of like in your arm here, like this. We have bones internally, and so our muscles attach to our bones, and that's how we move. When the muscles contract, one part is attached to one bone, one part is attached to another bone. They often then can span a joint, so then that joint will then flex and allow the appendage to flex and move. So there are muscles on opposite sides of the joint, so then the other one can contract. So when this one contracts, then it stretches that one out, and the appendage can move back in the opposite direction. Some of their appendages, like here in the crustacea, they have pincers, and so these called a cheiliped, and the cheiliped can be very, very strong, so they can actually cut a fish right in half, or through the tissue, even through bone, because there's so much power in the cheiliped. Not all of them have that, but many of them do. Some of them have so much power in their appendage. So there's a group of crustacea called Mantis Shrimp, and the Mantis Shrimp, their appendages, they have different types. Some end in almost like a rounded club, and others end in what looks almost like a blade. And so the ones that are club-like, they can actually shoot out their appendage so fast and pull it back that they create a shock wave that, without even touching another animal in the water, can cause compression that can overload its senses and actually knock it unconscious. And some of them actually can hit other animals. If people put them into aquaria, sometimes by accident, they can smash the glass of the tank. And then the ones with the spear-like ones will stab other organisms. And so they're very, very strong. They're very powerful. And the muscular attachment to these jointed appendages allow them to be incredibly versatile. And that's kind of really the main thing. They can do so many different things. Like I said, from digging to flying to punching to biting, we'll talk about, and all sorts of other things that they do because of that connection. And it's really the exoskeleton that kind of allows them in a way to do that, because they have something for muscles to attach to. Some of the other organisms that have an outer covering or a cuticle, they have no interaction between it and their musculature. The musculature is separate internally in a tube, essentially, and it's disconnected from it. The cuticle is just an outer protective covering, and that's it. Whereas with these organisms, it's integrated into their body, and for their movement, their behavior, for everything else. So just kind of keep some of those things in mind. It's not just a dead outer covering, it's really essential for everything that they do. And then many of their sensors can go through it. So they might have sensory hairs and all that are sticking out through the cuticle, so they can actually have little structures sticking out, through it that then may take on then connection to the nervous system, so that they can actually pick those things up. So like have fine little nerves connected to them. All right, so we're talking about characteristics here, and specialization, and that's kind of a big theme, with the group. So segments of the body being specialized, sort of the head, abdomen, thorax. We have appendages being specialized. So we have appendages that are sensory, like antennae, appendages for flight, like wings. Here with the crustaceous, so they have appendages, obviously I mentioned this cheiliped for grasping, cutting other organisms. They'll have mandibles, so mouth parts essentially. So some appendages have evolved into structures around their mouth. Some of them will grab organisms, just kind of hold them to the mouth, and others are crushing and grinding. So they have appendages, like leg-like structures, but except they're around their mouth, they're called mouth parts, and then they can bite and grind up things as they pull them then into the mouth. So this is the mouth right here. And around it will be unique, specialized appendages. Like I said, they have antennae. One of the things I mentioned about the appendages and numbers of appendages being unique for categorizing the groups. So for example, in the cephalopods, they typically have 2 pair of antennae. So they typically have a long pair and a short pair. So these would be these little short antennae, and these are the longer antennae. The insects typically have 1 pair of antennae. Again, number of appendages per segment. Again, that's unique for some of the different groups, and I'll talk about that when we get into a little bit more talking about the groups. So they have other appendages here called swimmerettes. You don't have to necessarily know the name, but these are appendages along the abdomen of a crustacean that help them swim a little bit. Now the whole tail, this abdomen, is used for swimming. So typically when this animal swims in the water, it pulls the tail back like this, and so they actually swim in this direction. So they swim backwards. They don't swim forward. There are appendages along this bottom side of the cephalothorax that they use for walking or crawling. So they would move with these appendages forward. They might use a little swimmerettes if they're up on the water column to kind of keep them up on the water column or move them a little bit forward. But if they contract muscles in the abdomen, they can swim very fast, but they swim and move backwards. So again, a lot of different behaviors that they can display, a lot of different unique things that they can do because of the adaptations they have for the appendages and their structures. General things that I drew in here just to kind of point out, as opposed to just having a drawing. So you can actually look at something. The blue system here in both of them is the digestive system. So they have a complete digestive system. Typically, depending on the type of organism they eat, there may be modifications. So the cephalopods, for example, have more of a grinding structure as well with the stomach, so internally, so that they can actually grind up some of their food, like the annelids had, with their gizzard. Insects usually don't, because often their food tends to be more liquid, so they don't have to grind things up. But there are some that may be different, because there's such a great variety of them that have something like that. They have a circulatory system. So in this case, this purple structure here is representing a heart. And in these, this purple structure again is representing a dorsal blood vessel that has contractile regions, sometimes referred to as hearts, but again, they're not really a heart. They're just parts of the circulatory system that can contract. And so, like I said, with insects, though, the circulatory system is typically minimized, very, very little. The respiratory system is usually a number of little holes that lead to little tubes, and then they extend through the body, called trachea. So there's little spiracles, there are little holes, and then there's the trachea, which are these little branching tube, structures and so that they get oxygen and gases just pulled in from the atmosphere, and then they often go directly into their tissues. Right? And so their circulatory system tends to be greatly reduced, in this group. Whereas in the crustacea, they tend to have gills, which I didn't include, here in the structure. So they have these large feathery structures that are used for taking oxygen, out of the water around them, and then they're integrated with the circulatory system, and so then they can then respire and have little branches of that circulatory system spread out. They're not as worried about weight being in the water, and like I said, in addition, their exoskeletons often has chemical components of it to make it purposefully heavier in the water. So having a heavier circulatory system isn't any kind of problem for an animal that lives in an aquatic environment like that. It's more of a problem for some animal that flies and needs to keep its weight down. So they don't want a lot of extra fluid in their body. What else do I have in the picture I didn't talk about? I think that's pretty much it. So this is the green represents the nervous system, the ventral nerve cord. The blue represents the digestive tract, and then this purple is supposed to represent circulatory, or just some of the way that the structure is branched. That gives you the major arthropod characteristics, a little bit about the cuticle, or what we call this exoskeleton, right, in this group, a little bit about how it molts, how the bodies are segmented, how there's specialization within the segments, how they have appendages, how the appendages are specialized, how the appendages are jointed, and a little bit about how the musculature interacts with the appendages and around the joints, so that they can actually move in a whole variety, of different ways. So with a group being so big, could spend forever just still talking about general characteristics, let alone all the groups of them. So that's going to be it for this particular lecture, and then the next one we'll look at some of the diversity by breaking them down into a few different groups.